Okay, so now we're going to start following along with book 3, but we're going to do it with the rollerball example. So you'll want to follow along with chapter 3 to get some of the details that are missing, but of course you'll also need to pay attention to the lecture here in order to understand some of the details that are different because we're working with the rolling ball demo rather than continuing with the first person shooter. So the first two things we're going to do is we're going to create a couple variables. We'll start with a player health variable, and we're going to use, I think we'll use a floating point here, and then we'll also keep track of a player stamina. We'll make both of those visible objects, and we'll give the player health, we'll give a starting value of 10, and the stamina will do the same. We might change these down the line, but let's leave it with 10 for now. Okay, so we will be adding mechanics for those, but first let's go ahead and set up the GUI to represent these values on screen so that we can actually see in our HUD the values that we're dealing with. So to do that, we're going to create a new folder to store our GUI elements. And we'll create a user interface, a widget here. There it is. Calling it HUD. And so this is a blueprint, much different than any we've seen so far, but it still is a blueprint at the very least. And this is going to represent our HUD. So we're using Unreal Motion graphics to pull this together. This is the view for that. We have both a graph as we normally do, although it's a little bit different than we normally see. And then we have a designer that lets us lay out the graph. So we'll start by building our UI with this, and then we will look at how we connect that up. So we'll follow the setup with the book here where we create the, well, first the horizontal panel, or the horizontal box, and then having that in our space here, we will then create two vertical boxes to store the labels and slider bars. So first we'll change the name. Go here, and we'll call this our player stats. Put two vertical boxes in. Call the first one the player stats labels. I'm going to change the name a little bit from the book here. Okay, and then I will create a health label. I will change the text of that health label. So I'm going to call it health here and also health there. And that way we have it stored in the right location. And again, we will do the same thing for stamina. And then finally we will bring over a couple progress bars. We'll bring one in here. Actually should have been part of our stat sliders here. So if it doesn't land correctly, as you saw when I dragged it over, I can just drag it within this hierarchy here to fix that. And so we'll have our player health bar here, and so I'll just bring it in here. Okay, so now we have the setup, but it doesn't quite look right, but that's okay. Okay, so let's start adjusting the layout here. We will start by fixing our anchor over here to the top right corner, since that's where I've placed the header. You are welcome to change that up. You can put it in the center or the left, but do make sure you test it out in the view to make sure that it fits in the view and that it looks as you'd expect, and when we start actually plugging it in there. And of course you can come back and change the anchor. So for this case I'm looking at my player stats and I want them to be anchored up here, and so I can see that I've got my anchor set there, and there's some shorthands to help me do that, right? To fit it and know that it will sit over here. And I'm setting it off from the corner because it's often a little bit painful to have to look at UI elements right up against the edge of the screen, and so that helps us verify that. So the next piece I'll do is set this to fill. So by setting the vertical widget here to fill in the space, it kind of ends up taking over the remainder of the space here. And so that's helpful for having our sliders actually use the space. And it's also nice because then if I decide I want to adjust it, my sliders still take up the majority of the space there, and the rest of it is just enough for the labels to work. Okay. Then from here we'll go ahead and set everybody to fill, because we want them to take over all of the space. And we can use the fact that we're now filling to control a little bit how big we want this to look, and take care of some of that there. So again, what we're seeing is we can now, because we've set sort of the fill and controlled it carefully, we're looking at a setup where we can sort of adjust our bars to whatever size makes sense, something somewhat aesthetically pleasing, but it still leaves us room to play with these values, right? So we're not stuck with whatever it is, in whatever state we kind of left it. We can move it around and adjust it, and this is always a good idea with UI elements to make sure that you can adapt as the game progresses, and especially as you start to add more UI elements or things like that. Okay, and then finally let's adjust the elements themselves. I'm going to set the health and stamina both to hug the right hand side here, and I'm also going to set them to be vertically centered, so that rather than kind of hugging the top edge there, they actually sit kind of even with the bars, which feels a little nicer. Then for the bars, we'll set the color and fill. So we can actually see that. So because we don't yet know what our fill is, I'll go ahead and set these both to the percentage at 1. So if you're looking at this and wondering why percentage goes from 0 to 1 rather than 0 to 100, just think of this in terms of multiply it by 100 essentially. So a fraction multiplied by 100 becomes percent. We can look at, say, this 0.5 here as being really 0.50, and so it's 50%, right? Or 0.75 is 75%, and so 1 ends up being 100%. And for health, as we normally find, we will set it to red. Some games will differentiate that. They'll make health green. We'll make stamina green in this case, so rather than this sort of bluish green, let's go ahead and make it a little bit harder green here. Let's get rid of some of the blue color. We'll go into this region. I'm actually looking at my blue value here, so I could just opt to remove that entirely. And we get a reasonable color that way. Okay. Now I do have I have some screen modifications on that change the colors, so yours might not look exactly the same. Don't let that worry you. Certainly pick colors that you're comfortable with as you go. Colors that are distinct, that have a meaning, colors that you can reuse through the game. So if you have health pickups, you'll want them to generally be red, and if you have stamina pickups, you'll want them to generally be green or greenish. Patterns like that are important to maintain, but the color itself is kind of a design choice and a subjective choice, and so you're welcome to feel your range there in your own aesthetic as far as that kind of thing goes. Okay, and the last little bit of adjustment here, simply because I don't like things butting up against each other. We already have sort of a gutter here between the edge of our sliders and the window. Let's also put a gutter in between our text and our borders. So I've got this selection for padding here. And I'm going to set some padding to the right. I'm going to do 10 pixels of padding, which will give us a little bit of space there. Not a ton, but enough that we can feel it. And then I'm also going to do the same for my bars. So I'm actually going to put a little bit of padding. Go ahead and put 5 padding on the bottom and top of each of these, so I get an even amount of spread there between the two. without adding too much extra layer. Actually, although I like 5, I'm going to go ahead and do 10 on both. Yeah, just a little bit tighter. Okay, and then another place that we're going to veer from the book is we will create a label here, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in the center. We'll put 2 text objects in here. This is our horizontal block here. But the difference here is we're going to only keep track of 1 counter, and it's going to be a collectible. So rather than enemies killed or how much ammo we have left, we're not going to worry about that. Our goal with our ball is to simply collect all of the objects in the level, and we'll of course make it interesting to collect those objects. I'm going to cheat a little bit and just call these label and value, but and I will just set this to 0 for now. Now here's one where we can check it out. I'll go ahead and put some padding in again. I'll do a left padding of about 5. When we do a value like this, it's always good when you're building a GUI to check out how large you want to go. So if you have upwards of 1,000 or even 1,000,000 objects, you might want to make sure that whatever you're going to get to is going to fit in there. For some old games, it used to be kind of interesting when you could hit the edge of the block and find out what would happen if you went far enough that you got it to wrap, right? So a lot of old games would say only have 6 digits, and what happens if you hit 1,000,000, and there's documentaries now of the kinds of people that did that sort of thing. But anymore, although it's a sort of a nice world that it was in, it's now better to kind of think ahead, make sure that you understand what your upper limit is, and then make sure that you have enough space in your text to actually fit that. So I'm happy with this. So let's go back to our physics ball setup, and let's actually connect up this HUD so we can see it in our view. So we don't have a begin play in the ball as it started. Again, this is an event that fires off at the very beginning when you press the play button, and never again. And so it's a good place to set things up. But we use other things like these, our sprint and our move right and so on. These events happen continually through the game, and we also saw event tick as another option, which is constantly called, and a way that we can set up, timers in some cases to fire off. So we will create a widget here. So we'll look for create widget, but when we actually select the HUD, it will change the name to create HUD widget. So don't let that confuse you. What you're searching for is the create widget node, and then once you've done that, then once you attach the class that we created, the HUD class, then it'll change the name. Okay, and then after that, we're going to go ahead and add it to the viewport, and we'll take the return value, and that's what we're going to add. Okay, now don't forget to compile and save as always. In fact, it looks like I didn't save over here, and we will play and see if we see it. Okay, so this is good. We can see that we've collected 1,000,000 of whatever we're collecting, coins or whatever. We have a health and we have a stamina, but of course they don't update, right? So we can use our stamina. So we're going to of course connect the stamina up so that we can't sprint forever. It's going to have a timer associated with it, and the health is going to detract us from winning the game, right? Okay, so we're going to start with creating our bindings. So this is the way that we bind a variable in our player character to something that we're seeing here, right? So what we need to do is first pick one of the bars, the health bar, the stamina bar. We'll start with the health bar, and over here where we were playing around with the percentage value before and just changing it dynamic or by ourselves manually, we are going to bind a new function to it. And this is really going to look like our functions or events as we've already done, and it's going to be called whenever it wants to update that bar, so it could be called potentially fairly often. And then what we return here in this slot is what value we want to show up in there. So we want to return a value from 0 to 1 to represent what that bar should be. Okay, So we'll start by getting the player pawn. Now the book will say get player character. Our ball, our physics ball here is a pawn. It's not a character. A character can be animated, and so it's a different kind of thing. The ball is not animated. And so you'll need to look for that difference. Get player pawn is the player character, but from there we can still cast to physics ball BP. And if all goes well with that cast, then we will be able to get a hold of various parts of that. So this is now a place where we can successfully pull values out of the physics ball. Okay, so here's one where we could potentially change our health from 10 to 1, and then we could just use the health directly. Since we've left it at 10, we'll go ahead and leave it there. I'm going to add a new variable called max health, just to show a difference for handling this. And we will create that as a float as well. In this case, I would set this to 10 as well, right? And so this is a slight change, but here where you might use the event begin play in a different way, where we would say set player health to get max health. And so what this says is rather than relying on this default health value, we can set up a max health, and the reason for that is then we can come over here and rather than just needing to assume or needing to know that our max health is 10, we're actually storing that in a variable that we can reuse, right? And so over here in the HUD we can say get player health, and we can also say get max health, and then what we're going to do is divide these two. We'll say divide the player health by the max health, and then that is the value that we return. Okay, so what this means is that in the gameplay, under the collision incidents, and we'll see this in a moment when we actually set these up, we'll set up a collision. We will capture how hard you've collided and modify your health based on that. We will be modifying the player health. That's going to be the part that we change through the course of the game. Our max health lets us know what the actual maximum value is, right? So we can still play around with it as being from 0. We could even say this is 0 to 100, right? Or set the max health to 100, and then that lets our player's health go from 0 to 100 that way. And so given that, we can sort of arbitrarily change that. Now if we wanted to, we could go back and say, no, I want my health to be 0 to 1. I will leave you that option. Those of you who want to explore that as a way of changing things up. You can set all of your health to 0 to 1, and then you just adjust all of your damage so that it's fractions of 1, right? And deal with it there. So again, it's becomes sort of a choice. In fact, we'll treat the stamina that way. I think we'll treat the stamina as a 0 to 1 case here, just to show that example. In fact, I'll set that to 1, and then our health will continue to be that way. Okay, so we've done the we've set this up. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for the stamina bar. Let's come back to our designer over here, and we'll click on the stamina bar, and we'll again say bind, and we'll create a binding. And on this one, again, we're going to get the player pawn. We're going to cast it to a physics ball. And again, recall from prior lectures, this is a way to get a hold of the player's pawn, the player's state, and then we're able to actually talk to those variables as long as those variables are visible to some degree. And then this one, since we're getting the stamina, again, off of that player, and we know that stamina is going to be from 0 to 1, we can just draw that directly into the control there. Okay. So we don't have all of the setup here, but what we should be able to see, at least when we press play now, is that our setup over here continues to show full bars, right? So it's hard to, maybe not convincing that these full bars are because we've now bound them. Actually, one thing we can do to test that out And come in here and set my player health to 5, or set my stamina to 0.5, and we see that the bars move that way. So we can actually change them dynamically this way to test it out. So we see that our bars are hooked up, and now we need to actually add some gameplay in there. You will notice too that the bars have sort of a maximum of 1. It's kind of up to you on the code side and your gameplay to maintain these maximums. It's not necessarily up to the GUI to keep track of that for you. Alright, and then we want to set up the binding here for a collected. We will actually need to come back over here and set up a collected variable. This one I am going to make an integer because I know I'm going to collect individual objects rather than, partial objects. I'm not going to collect 0.3 of something. So I'm going to collect a counter. So an integer makes a lot of sense in this case, and I'm defaulting to 0 because I start by having collected nothing, and I'm not too worried about what the upper value is, what the upper bound is. I could, in my gameplay, say that you have to collect at least 10, so I might say 0 out of 10 collected or something, and decide that there's an upper bound, or if I need to unlock a door by collecting a certain amount. But in our case, at least for now, we don't know how many collectibles we'll put in the level. We could sort of change our minds about that later on and just add more collectibles as we go by just bringing new blueprints in of our collectible object. But when we do the collection, when we actually hit the collectible object, we do want to increment our collected count and then have that increase, right? So however many we have in the level, that's what our maximum will be, but we know that we start with 0 and we go up as high as whatever it ends up being. So now that we've got that in there, we're once again going to come over to our value, and this is why we split up the two labels separately, so it's easier to just modify the value part, right? And we'll come in here and we'll do a binding on the text piece. Okay, so we create the binding, and now rather than returning a floating point value or whatever 0 to 1 value as we did before, here we need to return a string. Okay. So not too much different. We're once again going to get the player pawn, and we're going to cast this. And then this time we will, oops, I'm going to convert this to a string. So there's a couple different ways to do this. You could also do other kinds of string conversion. Actually, I think we can go directly into toText. So let me try to change that. So we want toText rather than toString. And so if you run into that, of course, we could, so I converted to string in the first place. That wasn't entirely correct. It decided to try to do the conversion for me. I can actually do that manually myself by plugging this in. It'll try to figure out the right conversion. So that's actually a shortcut to do this. So again, what I did is pull from here to here, and it tries to figure out if there's a conversion. Often with strings and texts, that's an easy conversion to make. Okay, and then with that, we have so we have our text converted. And assuming this all worked, then coming over here, when I press the play button, I should see that it turned to 0 based on the fact that my collected object was 0. I can test this out again, just like I did before. Actually, I need to make that visible so I can test it out. So let's come over here and make this one visible. Make sure to compile and save as always. And we'll come over here and take a look at it. And now we'll see if I change my collected to 10, then I notice that it changes up here, right? And so when we plug in the gameplay that actually gets the collectible objects and gives us the opportunity to do that, then we'll know that when we change that value, it's going to change over here as well.